EVO. Morning light has a way of insisting on clarity. It pours across rooftops, it washes through kitchen windows, and pulls dust mites into the air like tiny planets shifting slowly through space. Morning wants things to make sense. It wants the world restored to order. It wants last night's fears to look small, almost embarrassing in the daylight. But sometimes, morning does not repair the night. Sometimes it amplifies it. In Flatwoods, West Virginia, the sun rose on September 13th, 1952, but the town did not wake up from its terror. It woke squarely inside it. Radios hummed with rumors, people stood in kitchens whispering over cups of coffee. Children refused to go outside. Grown men found excuses to stay near home. The sky, which should have been reassuring, felt instead like a vast, unanswered question. And a few minutes from now, we'll reach the moment when investigators climb that hill with notebooks and tape measures and military calm, determined to quiet the story, and instead uncovered something that felt less like explanation and more like another riddle. Morning promised truth, but it delivered complexity. And sometimes the devil within is our refusal to accept that complexity when what we desperately want is certainty. Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is part 2 of the Flatwoods Monster, the monster that wasn't. Part 1 left us on the hill, with lights, fear, a towering figure, and the birth of a legend. Tonight we walk back into that same clearing, but we do it slowly, with investigators, scientists, and skeptics on our side. This isn't the part of the story where the monster wins. It's the part where the human mind steps into the center of the narrative and forces us to question whether what happened was supernatural or entirely painfully human. So stay with us, because before long, we're going to arrive at the exact discovery that reshaped the entire case, the moment when one simple detail reframed everything we thought we knew and turned terror into something far more unsettling. Not a lie, but a misunderstanding that had grown teeth. Chapter 4. It's easy decades later to imagine investigators marching onto that hill with skepticism fully formed, convinced from the start that they would debunk the story. But that's not how most people approach uncertainty. Sheriff Robert Carr drove out to the Bailey Fisher farm early that morning with an open mind and a sense of responsibility pressing on him like weight across his shoulders. A community had been frightened. Children had collapsed crying. Adults had described nausea and headaches, burning throats, and dizziness. The obligation was not merely to explain, but to restore trust in the world itself. He climbed the hill slowly, scanning as he walked. He expected to find scorch marks, a shattered impact crater, maybe some twisted metal torn from whatever had fallen from the sky. He expected evidence of force. Instead, he found silence. Grass lay flattened in odd places, not violently, but as though someone had simply laid down there for a while. The earth showed no signs of trauma. Trees stood untouched. Branches were unbroken. If something had crashed, it had done so with an elegance that physics just simply doesn't allow. But the smell remained. It drifted in faint waves across the clearing, sharp, metallic, and still vaguely rotten. The odor caught at the back of the throat, a caustic sensation that suggested chemicals. It was unpleasant enough that several men gagged. The sheriff felt lightheaded and stepped briefly away, surprised at how quickly discomfort had just blossomed. It would have been easy to assign that dizziness to radiation or poisoned air. But truth rarely aligns itself to the fantasies we build around it. Now, news traveled quickly. By noon, not only police, but also men in military uniforms had arrived. They took samples, they asked questions, they paced methodically. Reporters followed, hungry for image and implication. Their presence turned the scene into theater. Witnesses, invited or not, narrated what they remembered for strangers with notebooks, and with each retelling, the event hardened into mythology. The more it was spoken aloud, the more it became permanent. and one detail repeated across all accounts. The smell had triggered sickness, nausea, headaches, weakness. People spoke about their bodies as though the environment itself had attacked them. When fear pairs with physical sensation, memory fuses with conviction. It no longer becomes possible to separate what the mind experienced from what actually happened. And then came the first quiet voice of reason, not from a journalist or a soldier, but from a man who had walked enough land to know that sometimes the earth gives off odors for much simpler reasons. He suggested gas. He suggested chemicals used in farming. He suggested the possibility that something natural had been disturbed. But his suggestion didn't interest anyone. It didn't fit the narrative. Emily Dickinson, again, understood the way fear chooses its language. She wrote often about the mind's ability to take the ordinary and clothe it in dread. That morning on the hill, dread wore the shape of an invisible contaminant, an invading presence. To believe in contamination is easier than believing in ambiguity. By afternoon, the hill had become both sacred and contaminated. Parents warned children to stay away. Strangers arrived, drawn by curiosity, only to be repelled by caution. Local authorities couldn't keep everyone out, and every footprint layered over the last. Every impression disrupted what clues might have remained. And somewhere beneath all that activity was the truth, already fragile, but now trampled. Now, the investigation might have ended there, reduced to hearsay and photographs, if not for the testimonies that kept coming from neighboring towns. Fireballs in the sky, bright red streaks, objects trailing sparks. Something had indeed moved across West Virginia that night. Something had burned in the atmosphere, and something had fallen beyond the ridge. It just wasn't a craft. Scientists confirmed meteor activity. Radio operators had heard chatter across states. The fire, however dazzling, wasn't alien. It was celestial debris, dragged into gravity and consumed by it. That discovery should have reinforced calm. Instead, it just layered more confusion. If the light in the sky had been ordinary space debris, what then of the towering figure? What of that glide, the hiss, the eyes, the oppressive presence? It's one thing to explain a streak of fire, okay. It's another to explain terror that feels intelligent. That question led investigators not outward toward the stars, but inward, toward the clearing again, toward the trees and branches and the way shadows distort. And slowly, inconveniently, a more grounded picture began to form. Answers were coming, but they wouldn't feel satisfying, because they rarely do. Chapter 5. The second phase of the investigation didn't look dramatic. It involved wildlife guides, naturalists, and men who understood forests as well as others understood machinery. They walked the perimeter with patience. They studied markings with a kind of reverence. And while others still whispered about extraterrestrial craft, these men asked one deceptively simple question: what lives here? They cataloged the obvious: deer, raccoon, fox. They considered nocturnal behavior. They examined limbs high in the trees where larger birds might perch. They found traces of feathers. They found pellets. They found the remains of small animals that had been prey. And then, almost quietly, someone suggested barn owls. Sound familiar? Barn owls don't share the gentle, round-faced innocence of some of their cousins. They possess elongated bodies, ghost-like wings, heart-shaped faces. At night, when a light hits them just right, their eyes seem to glow from within. When threatened, they don't bark or scream. They hiss, a long, spine-chilling exhalation that rustles through the night with uncanny force. Perched high on a branch, a large owl can appear as tall as the figure that frightened those witnesses. Surrounded by fog, framed by branches, it can look as though it floats rather than stands. The mental picture didn't land easily. After all, how could a simple bird replace the towering, armored creature of a headline frame? And since it's the same culprit as last week's episode, but last week's episode, if you remember, the creature seemed small, squat. This one was tall, towering. Freaking owls, man. And here comes our anchor moment for part 2. A demonstration was arranged. At night, under controlled conditions, a light was pointed upward towards a perched owl. Fog machines produced a low mist. Witnesses stood back at the same approximate distance as the group on the hill. The flashlight beam cut upward. And there, suspended against the darkness, the owl transformed. Its body elongated, its head, haloed by feathers, took on the unmistakable silhouette of the shovel-like hood described by Kathleen May. Its eyes burned in direct reflection. Its wings, slightly unfurled, drooped into shapes that looked disturbingly like long, narrow arms. When startled, it leaned forward and released that hiss, that furnace-breathing sound that had sent the original witnesses running for their lives. Now, why hadn't they recreated the scene back in Kentucky on the farm? I guess the sheriffs in West Virginia have more of a flair for the dramatic recreations than the sheriffs in Kentucky when it came to owls that people mistake for aliens. And the investigators watched this transformation unfold, not as myth, but as biology forcing an illusion. Fear had done the rest. When Robert Frost wrote that roads diverged, not because we carefully choose them, but because we only understand them in retrospect. The people of Flatwoods had found themselves at a similar fork in the road. They had perceived one thing. They had lived inside that terror. Only with distance could they see that their minds had interpreted threat where there had been none. The chemical odor was explained next. Soil samples revealed gases released naturally from the ground when heat and pressure stir buried compounds. Add adrenaline, add dizziness born of panic, add suggestion passing from one frightened person to another. The body experiences symptoms that it can't recognize, and quickly the environment becomes an enemy. Witnesses didn't lie. They misinterpreted. And that realization struck some of them harder than any alien encounter might have. To believe one has seen a monster, yes, it's terrifying. To realize one's mind has created the monster is something entirely different, something that reaches deeper into identity. If the brain can betray us so completely, what else is uncertain? This is where the devil within took shape, not as metaphor, but as diagnosis. Fear isn't content with absence. It requires narrative. The Flatwoods Monster allowed that fear to crystallize into something with a face. Dismantling the face didn't dismantle the fear. It merely revealed how much of it had been constructed from within. Now, of course, not everyone accepted the explanations. Some insisted the demonstration failed to capture exactly what they saw. Others were insulted by the implication that a bird had fooled them. Belief, once rooted, doesn't surrender so easily. And so 2 stories began to exist at once, the official narrative and the private narrative. Both, in their own way, were true. Chapter 6. Time moved forward, but legends don't age at the same pace as facts. Where the investigation quieted, the storytelling didn't. The Flatwoods Monster left the hill and entered culture. It appeared in magazines, speculative radio shows, and whispered accounts shared on porches long after the children had been sent to bed. Over the years, the figure became sharper in imagination than it had ever been in life. The people who lived through it carried something more complicated than mere memory. They carried the uneasy awareness that their minds had once been overwhelmed, that their senses had betrayed them at the precise moment they most needed accuracy, that recognition breeds humility, but it also breeds unease. If fear can rewrite perception so quickly, then certainty itself becomes fragile. Psychologists studying the case decades later noted a pattern common to communities exposed suddenly to stress. When the unknown collides violently with daily life, the brain creates a story that protects the self from chaos. It's safer to believe in an invader from elsewhere than to believe the world is random and unexplainable. A monster at least has motive. Emily Dickinson lived much of her life in isolation. Her poems wrestled with unseen forces, grief, doubt, spiritual unease. She understood that the mind, left to itself, can build entire universes out of suggestion. In Flatwoods, an entire town had briefly joined her in that struggle. What then remains after the monster dissolves under scrutiny? A lesson, perhaps. Not a cynical one, but a sober one. The world is not always as dramatic as our minds insist. And yet the experience of terror is real, regardless of whether its object is real. The children who ran down the hill weren't acting. Their bodies believed, their hearts believed, and in that sense, the monster existed completely, if only for a little while. Today, Flatwoods embraces the creature as heritage. There are statues, there's souvenirs, there's festivals. Tourists come to see where it all happened. The myth offers a kind of comfort. If we can name our fear, we can live with it. If we can sculpt it in metal and plastic, we can place it safely outside of ourselves. But beneath the tourist smiles and novelty t-shirts is still the question that refuses to leave entirely. What if just once the explanation missed something? What if there had been a presence on that hill the investigation never accounted for? What if the owl stood there, yes, but something else stood behind it? Now, this isn't an invitation to conspiracy. It's an acknowledgement of humility. Science answers many, if not most, questions. Psychology answers others. But neither can fully map the hidden territory that's inside the human heart, the place where fear and wonder intersect. In that space, the monster remains, not as fact, but as symbol. And symbol, unlike biology, doesn't die. The Flatwoods Monster endures not because it was real, but because it allowed a community for one night to give shape to the shapeless, to name the darkness, to assign it a face. In the end, the devil within may simply be the part of ourselves that can't sit quietly inside uncertainty. We demand stories. We demand coherence. We demand an answer even when silence would be more honest. But silence is hard. So we build monsters, and then we tell their stories for the rest of our lives. Unsolved does not always mean supernatural. Sometimes it means human, unbearably, painfully human. What happened in Flatwoods wasn't a visitation from another world. It was a visitation from our own minds. Robert Frost suggested that the roads we walk gain meaning only after we have traveled them. The people of Flatwoods walked a road they never planned to take, and only afterward understood that it had led them into the landscape of fear. They returned, technically, to their homes, but a part of them never quite came back. Because here's the most unsettling part. Flatwoods wasn't the last time this happened. Across other towns, other hills, other nights, people would see shapes in the dark. They would breathe strange air, feel panic take hold, and swear that they had met something beyond comprehension. And the question we're left with is not whether monsters exist. It's whether we're always prepared to recognize that the monster is us. Next time on The Devil Within, we step into another disappearance, another night, another mind pushed beyond its ability to interpret what it sees. No monsters, no demons, just the terrifying space between what happened and what we believe happened. If you enjoyed these episodes, if you followed me into the quiet, make sure you're following The Devil Within on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Leave a rating and a review because it genuinely helps others to find the show. And share this series with someone who loves thoughtful, grounded mystery. And email your thoughts, your theories, your own stories, complaints, suggestions to info@evocreative.com and visit our website to explore more. And we'll meet again soon inside The Devil Within. And don't forget to check the show notes for amazing deals from the great sponsors that still support long-form storytelling. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.